At 14 degrees, most people under that bridge wouldn't make it through the night. Maria Alvarez didn't have a heater. She had a top, some scrap wood, and one idea that would keep her alive. At 5:18 in the evening, with the light already thinning under the bridge, Maria Alvarez stood with a folded silva top pressed against her chest and watched dust move down the concrete channel in long gray ribbons. The air was 34 degrees. The underside of the bridge smelled like cold cement, old rain, damp cardboard, and the tar scent that lifted off the road deck every time a truck passed overhead. Each time one crossed, the whole span gave off a low iron groan. She was not looking for a place to sleep for one more night. She was looking for a wall. She found it on the south side of the channel, a poured retaining wall almost 7 feet high, stained with rust and mineral lines, still holding a trace of heat from the afternoon sun. When she pressed her palm against it, it felt different from the air around her. Not warm, exactly. Just slower to let go. She set down the tarp. It was 12 feet by 16 feet, silver on one side, brown on the other, heavy enough to matter and cheap enough to be all she could afford. It cost $30. That left her with $17 in cash, a transit pass with 3 rides still on it, and a plastic toolbox that fit under one arm. The people already living under the bridge watched from their own spots without getting up. Tasha sat in a faded lawn chair with a wool cap pulled low over her ears. Reggie was stripping copper from the appliance cord with a box cutter, saving the clean wire for scrap. Vernon held a dented steel mug over a can fuel flame, waiting on coffee. They had all seen people show up with plans. Most of those plans lasted until the first wind. Maria dragged the top across the gravel shelf and laid one edge against the wall. Then she began measuring with her feet. 8 paces one way, 6 back. She looked at the direction of the wind, at the pale line where rainwater had dried after the last storm, at the bridge deck above, and at the narrow strip of ground that sat just high enough to stay out of the center runoff. She wanted the opening turned away from the north. She wanted the sleeping surface off the ground. She wanted 2 skins with air between them. She wanted the wall to store heat through the day and give it back slowly after dark. She wanted the whole thing small enough that her own body could change the temperature inside it. The first gust hit before she had anything weighted. The top snapped so hard it sounded like a rifle shot in the echo under the bridge. One corner jumped out of her hand and bellied toward the channel. Maria dropped to one knee in the gravel and pinned it down with both hands. Dust hit her face. The edge burned a red line across her palm. Reggie laughed first. It was not cruel. It was the laugh of a man who had watched too many half-built shelters tear themselves apart. "You're building a house with that thing," he called out. Maria did not answer. She kept one hand on the top and looked back at the wall. Reggie glanced at Vernon and grinned. "That silver sheet's gonna be in Texas by midnight." Maria was 47 years old and had spent most of her working life inside rooms that belonged to other people. For 11 years she worked in housekeeping at a hotel near the airport. Then she moved into light maintenance because she was the one who noticed problems before they got expensive. She learned how to replace weather stripping, patch drywall, stop a sink trap from leaking, reset a door closer, and track down a draft with the back of her wrist. She was never licensed in a trade. Men with trucks and company shirts made more money than she did. But if a room smelled damp, Maria could usually tell if it was a bad vent fan, a leaking wax ring, a cracked seal around the tub, or condensation collecting on cheap glass. She understood how air moved in a room. She understood how moisture built up. She understood that a small gap could undo a whole wall. Her life did not collapse in one big scene. It came apart in small bills, cut hours, and promises she kept making to herself because the truth was still harder to say. The divorce came first. There was no shouting worth remembering. Her husband had been driving loads across the state for years, and by the end there were 2 people passing rent notices back and forth instead of speaking. He left. Maria stayed in the apartment because leaving meant paying deposits she did not have, and because she still believed a person who worked every week ought to be able to hold on to a 1-bedroom place. The rent had been $875 when they moved in. By the time he left, it was $1,240. That number hung over everything. Then the hotel changed hands. A regional maintenance company got the lodger repair jobs. Maria kept her place, but the 40 hours she counted on turned into 32, then 28, then some weeks 26. She cleaned rooms again to make up what she could. Her knees swelled at night. She stopped buying meat unless it had the yellow markdown sticker on it. The savings went next. She had $4,860 in a credit union account after the divorce papers were signed. She used it for rent shortfalls, her inhaler, an emergency brake job, and the deposit on a storage unit after she convinced herself that downsizing would help her get ahead. It did not help. It just made the loss look organized. By summer, she was living in her minivan. It was a 2007 model with 182,000 miles, a rear hatch that never shut quite right in cold weather, and a passenger window motor that had died 2 years earlier. Maria cut window covers out of reflective insulation scraps she found behind a remodel. She learned which parking lots stayed quiet until 4 a.m. and which ones got swept by security at midnight. She slept with her keys under her thigh and her shoes pointed toward the side door. At first she told herself it was temporary. 2 weeks. A month. Just long enough to catch up. But rent kept rising, storage fees did not stop, and the van started making a dry metal sound in second gear that made her chest tighten each time she heard it. The last week it ran, Maria kept a gallon jug of water on the floor, 2 blankets, 1 change of work clothes, a flashlight, and a plastic toolbox with pliers, screwdrivers, a utility knife, electrical tape, and an old analog thermometer the hotel had thrown out during a renovation. The dial was scratched but still accurate enough. She had checked it against the lobby thermostat before she lost the job for good. The van quit on a Friday afternoon half a mile past a left turn, 1 block short of a gas station where she planned to wash her face and use the restroom. The engine revved. The van did not move. She coasted to the curb under a line of bare trees and sat with both hands on the steering wheel for 7 minutes. Tow yards charge by the day. Repair shops want an answer at the counter. Maria had neither money nor a story that would change the price. She sold the battery, sold the jack, sold the catalytic converter for less than it was worth. She kept the blankets, the toolbox, the thermometer, 2 milk crates, and 1 plastic tote of clothes. The rest stayed in the van until other people took what they needed from it. Her first night sleeping rough was on gravel behind a chain-link fence near an industrial lot. She did not sleep. The ground took heat out of her so fast it felt active, like a force. At 3:10 in the morning she moved because the cold had worked through both blankets and into her hips. By dawn her hands were stiff, and she understood something in a way that no motel room had ever required her to understand. Cold was not just cold. The cold moved. It came up through concrete. It slid under the fabric. It gathered inside wet seams. It settled into anything pressed against the ground. People said they froze because the air was cold. Maria knew better. People froze because whatever warmth they had could leave in too many directions at once. Over the next few weeks she moved from one temporary spot to another. A bus stop alcove for 1 night. The edge of an arroyo for 2. A vacant lot with weeds tall enough to block the wind but not the noise. She watched where people set up and why. She noticed which tents stayed dry, which ones trapped moisture, which spots seemed hidden until a hard rain turned them into channels. Then she came under the bridge. It was not safe in any complete sense. It was loud. It could be swept. In a real storm, water could still move through the channel. But the bridge cut the open sky, which cut frost. The retaining walls stored sun. The gravel shelf on the south side sat higher than the center runoff line, and other people were already there, which meant danger was at least visible. By the second evening she had her blankets, her crates, her tote, and her toolbox stacked against the wall. By the third, she had decided she was not going to spend winter inside thin nylon and hope. She was going to build a room. The thing Maria noticed was so plain most people stopped seeing it after one look. At 4:40 in the afternoon, when the air had already begun to drop, the retaining wall still held heat. Not enough to make the place comfortable by itself. Not enough to save anyone without work. But enough to matter if you built around it the right way. Hotels had taught her that a livable room did not have to be hot. It had to be dry, cut off from moving air, and small enough that the heat inside it could stay where it was made. The wall could give her thermal mass. The bridge deck could shield her from frost and some of the weather. If she built a shell that trapped still air and kept her body off the ground, she would need far less heat than people thought. She spent 2 days gathering before she tied the first piece of wire. From behind an appliance store she pulled 6 flattened refrigerator boxes, dry in the middle even though the outside faces were stained. From an apartment turnover pile she took 8 pine bed slats, 1 cracked, 7 good, plus a short piece of half-inch plywood with 1 clean edge. A crew doing a roof patch had thrown foil-faced insulation scraps into an open roll-off. When the workers were gone, Maria climbed halfway in and pulled out 5 pieces big enough to use, each about 18 by 30 inches, with black tar stuck to one side and silver facer on the other. The metal signposts came from a city scrap stack near a fenced yard where bent materials had been left for pickup. They were already discarded, already cut, and light enough to carry one at a time. She found 3 almost straight and 2 bowed. Later she found a 6th. The old bolt holes in them turned out to be useful. The wool blankets came from a church handout 3 bus rides away. Gray, brown, 1 army green, all rough and heavy and still carrying a faint lanolin smell. She chose wool because wet cotton stays cold and synthetic throws off moisture in a bad way against plastic. Wool can stay useful even when the air turns hard. By then the other people under the bridge had stopped pretending not to watch. Reggie turned it into a running joke. He was maybe 38, thin as wire, quick with his hands, good at finding anything that could be traded by the pound. Every time Maria came back with another load, he gave a low whistle. "You need permits for that palace?" he asked once. Tasha laughed, but not for long. She was in her early 30s and folded even her worn things neatly. She worried about attention. A shelter that looked too solid could bring police faster than a tent. "You build it too nice," she told Maria. "They'll notice it." Vernon was the one who seemed honestly concerned. He was 63, diabetic, with a white beard and the top of one finger missing from machine work he had done years ago outside Clovis. He had seen too many people wrap themselves in plastic and wake up colder than before. "I've watched people seal themselves in and come out soaked," he said. "You trap your breath in there, that whole thing turns wet." Maria nodded because he was right. Moisture could ruin everything. That was exactly why she planned for vents. She studied the wall as the shadows changed. The opening would face east-southeast, away from the worst of the north wind. The long side would run tight to the retaining wall. The sleeping platform would sit 18 inches above the gravel. There would be an outer shell, then an air gap, then an inner layer. Not tall enough to stand in, big enough to crawl into, sit up, sleep warm, and hold what heat a body made. The part other people missed was simple. Most people build for space. Maria was building for volume. If you want to find out what Maria built under that bridge, and what happened when the cold snap hit Albuquerque, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Maria built in that drainage channel is a story that says more about knowledge, dignity, and survival than most people are ready to hear. She started with the floor because she knew the ground would steal warmth before the walls had a chance to help. She scraped the gravel level with a broken board and a length of rebar. Then she laid down a first layer of cardboard, glossy side down. Over that she placed 2 rows of milk crates on their sides, 6 in all, spaced a hand's width apart so they would not rock. The piece of plywood bridged part of the top. Bed slats spanned the rest. It only had to do one job: get her body off the gravel and trap air underneath. The platform failed in under 3 minutes. When Maria climbed onto it with one knee, the cracked slat snapped with a dry pop and one crate twisted outward. Her shin went into the gravel. She sat back against the wall and looked at the broken slat. The spacing, the height, the leverage. It was not bad luck. It was span. Too much distance between supports. Reggie did not laugh that time. By sunset she had scavenged 2 cinder blocks with broken corners and a short piece of 2x4 from a demolition pile. The rebuilt platform sat 18 inches high at the wall side and 16 at the front because of the slope. She tightened the gaps between the slats to less than 10 inches, ran the 2x4 down the center as a stiffener, and tested it with both knees before trusting it with her weight. It was held. Next came the frame. She drove the signposts into tight spots between wall and gravel using a lump of broken concrete as a hammer. 3 posts ran along the wall as rear uprights. 3 leaned outward to form a low wedge. At the highest point, nearest the wall, the roof sat 52 inches above the platform. At the front edge it dropped to 34 inches. That low nose did 2 things. It cut wind load, and it cut the amount of interior air she would need to keep warm. She tied joints with stripped copper wire, doubled and twisted with pliers from her toolbox. Where bolt holes lined up, she pinned metal to wood with scavenged machine screws and mismatched nuts she had saved in a tobacco tin from her hotel years. It looked too light for what she expected of it, but when the slats went on as cross ribs and side braces, the shape stiffened. The wall side stayed 2 inches off the concrete. That was deliberate. She wanted the wall stored heat, but she did not want blankets pressed against damp concrete if weather shifted. Use the wall, she told herself, but do not marry it. The second principle was airspace. People who only have blankets and plastic usually pile everything tight and call it insulation. Maria knew crushed fabric loses much of what makes it useful. She wanted still air trapped between layers. Still air was free, and free things mattered. She stretched the silva top over the outside of the frame with a reflective face outward. Albuquerque winter sun is weak by late afternoon, but it is still sun. She wanted whatever little the shell could catch. She pulled the top tight enough to shed water, but not so tight that every gust would transfer all its force straight to the grommets. The top tore on the first serious wind anyway. A cross gust came under the bridge and yanked the north corner so hard the factory grommet ripped through the poly weave. The tear ran 4 inches before it stopped. Maria stared at it for a second, sat down on the platform, and thought. That was when Earl Benton walked over. Earl was 62 and moved like a man who had spent half his life looking under structures. He used to set and repair manufactured homes south of Socorro and in small towns where the wind never asked permission. He knew skirting, underfloor insulation, belly wrap, and what coal did when it found a weak seam. After his wife died, he drank through 2 jobs, sold that trailer to cover debt, and drifted from couch to truck to camp in 1 bad year. By the winter Maria met him. He was sleeping in a white van that had not started in months. He squatted beside the torn corner and touched the edge of the rip. "Grommet's not your anchor," he said. "The material around it is." He went back to his van and returned with 4 fender washers, a strip of old seatbelt webbing about 20 inches long, and a few self-tapping screws. He did not take over. He did not touch the frame unless Maria handed him something. He just showed her how to fold the torn top corner around the webbing, sandwich it with washers, and spread the strains so one little hole was no longer carrying the whole load. "You ask one weak point to do all the work," he said. "It fails like it was waiting to." Maria copied that fix at every high-stress corner after that. Fold. Webbing. Washer. Screw through scrap slat. Tie out. Not pretty. Strong. The walls went up in layers. Outer layer. The silver top. Inside that, hanging from wire loops tied to the bed slat ribs. She suspended the wool blankets so they barely touched the tarp at only a few points. The gap averaged about 1.5 inches on the sides and a little more near the roof. Into the coldest section she tucked the foil-faced insulation scraps, shiny side facing open air, not pressed flat against fabric. Behind that, where needed, she staggered dry cardboard panels to stop direct windwash. The floor got its own build. Cardboard over the slats. Then 1 blanket. Then a strip of carpet pad she found rolled behind a flooring shop. Then a second blanket. On top of that went her sleeping bag, repaired at the zipper with dental floss and black thread. The warmest part of the shelter had to be the place where she stopped moving. Everything else came second. The doorway was the smallest opening she thought she could live with. 22 inches wide. 30 inches high. You had to crouch and turn one shoulder to get inside. "You're gonna hate that every night," Tasha said. "Good," Maria answered. "Means the cold will hate it too." The third principle was vent high, not wide. Vernon had been right about trapped moisture. At the rear roofline, where the wedge met the retaining wall, Maria left a vent gap just under 2 inches, protected by a tarp flap that overlapped like a shingle. Warm, damp breath could rise and leave. Near the front, low and covered, she planned a smaller intake gap that would only be cracked when needed. Not enough to flood the shelter with outside air. Just enough to keep the inside dry. The second real setback came after a dirty rain that lasted less than 20 minutes. Maria crawled inside the unfinished shell with her flashlight and found moisture beading on the inside of the outer tarp. One edge of wool had wicked damp where it touched the shell. If she left that alone, the whole thing would slowly become a cold box. She backed out and sat still for 5 minutes. That was her way. No panic. No rushing to patch the surface. Look at it. Name the cause. Then fix the cause. The cause was contact. The next day she rehung the blankets with bent coat hanger spacers at 6 points beside and added a narrow slat ridge so the roof blanket lifted away from the tarp by a full inch. She widened the rear vent gap to almost 2 inches and cut a protected low intake near the doorway no larger than 3 fingers side by side. The next cold night, the inside stayed dry. Her hands changed before the build was done. The skin across her palms thickened and went gray at the edges from grit and nylon burn. A blister opened at the base of her right thumb and hardened again. Her shoulders ached so badly some mornings that lifting a gallon jug made her jaw tighten. She lost 6 pounds in less than 2 weeks because she was walking miles for material and eating whatever fit in a tote. Peanut butter, canned beans, crackers, instant oats softened with hot water. But the shelter kept taking shape. Earl checked on her twice more. The second time he brought half a roll of foil HVAC tape and showed her where to seal seams between the insulation scraps without blocking airflow. The third time he tapped the platform with his boot and said the line that stayed with her. "People think shelter is walls," he said. "Most winters it's the floor." By the end of the second week, the structure measured 7 feet 8 inches long along the wall, 5 feet 11 inches across at the broadest point, and a little under 4.5 feet high at the rear interior. Not a cabin in the way building inspectors use the word. More like a sleeping chamber with a crawl-in vestibule and one narrow bench made from leftover slats. Small enough that 2 adults could sit shoulder to shoulder inside if they bent forward. Small enough that one body could change the temperature. Maria weighted the top skirt with broken brick, gravel-filled bottles, and concrete chunks so wind could not get under it. Then she hung the scratched analog thermometer at shoulder height above the platform, near the rear sleeping chamber, and waited for a clear, cold night. The first real test came in December under a hard sky with no cloud cover to hold heat over the city. At 7:05 p.m., the air outside read 33 degrees on the thermometer Maria trusted more than anything else she owned. She crawled in, shut the flap behind her, and sat with her back near the wall without touching it. Right away she noticed what was gone. No draft at the neck. No knife edge of cold sliding under the bedding. The bridge noise softened into a low padded thump. She sat still because in a room that small, stillness mattered. Her own heat counted. So did the warmth the wall had stored through the afternoon. So did the fact that the sleeping chamber at the back was wrapped in blankets, cardboard, foam, tarp, and dead air. At 7:40 p.m. the thermometer read 48. At 8:10 it read 56. Maria reached up and checked the vent with the back of 2 fingers. The air leaving it felt damp but moving. Good. She let the flap settle again. At 8:43 p.m., with the outside air still dropping toward freezing, the thermometer inside settled at 65 degrees. Maria stared at it for a long time before she believed it. Then she took it down, held it in the doorway for a full minute, watched the reading drop, and hung it back in the sleeping chamber. It climbed again, more than 30 degrees warmer inside than out. She did not speak. She sat on the platform with her elbows on her knees and her hands pressed together between them. Her eyes filled, though not enough for anyone outside to notice when she finally opened the flap. Tasha was waiting a few feet away. "Well?" Maria held out the thermometer. Tasha leaned in and read it once, then again to make sure the low bridge light was not playing tricks. "No way," she said. Maria gave one small nod and drew the flap closed. That night she slept 6 hours without waking from the cold. At dawn the thermometer still read 58. Frost had formed outside on the gravel where her boots sat. Inside, the blanket by her face was dry. It was a small thing in the scale of a city. One woman, one top, one room under a bridge. But if you have spent enough nights with colds taking you apart inch by inch, a small thing can feel as large as law. If you have ever felt cut off, overlooked, or alone in plain sight, consider subscribing to stay connected with this community. Because stories like Maria's are a reminder that being unseen does not mean having nothing to offer. Connection is its own kind of shelter. The real test arrived the week before Christmas. Forecasts have been talking about it for 2 days. A sharp front dropping south. Strong wind. Overnight lows lower than normal for Albuquerque. In houses and apartments that meant frozen pipes and dead car batteries. Under the bridge, it meant a more basic question. Who would still be there in the morning? By Tuesday afternoon, the wind had shifted and strengthened. It came down the channel in long, steady pushes that found every loose edge in camp. Plastic bags lifted and spun away. The side of Reggie's blue tent snapped so hard the poles clicked like sticks. Tasha wrapped another blanket around her lap and kept checking the sky. The cold arrived fast after dark. At 9 p.m., the outside temperature was 19 degrees. A little after midnight, it hit 14. Before dawn, the airport station would record 11, with gusts near 30 miles an hour in open areas. Under the bridge, the wind was less than that, but sharper because it was channeled. It found corners. It was pressed at the seams. It made every weak shelter tell the truth. Across the city, emergency beds filled early. The day shelter stayed open as long as it could. Churches handed out blankets until they ran out. At one bus stop 2 miles away, a man slept sitting up because the warming center line had already gone out the door by the time he got there. Under the bridge, the first failure came at 1:20 in the morning. One of Reggie's tent poles punched through the fly and the roof sagged sideways under frost and wind. Maria heard the plastic whip, then heard him curse, then heard the thin, fast sound people make when their fingers stop working and they still have zippers to fight. She opened her flap and saw him on his knees in the gravel, both shoulders inside the tent, trying to hold up a bent pole while his hands shook. Maria stepped out in her coat and boots. "Bring what matters," she said. "Not everything." He looked at the shelter opening and gave a laugh that sounded more shocked than amused. "In there. In here." The room held 1 adult well, 2 adults badly, and 3 adults only if the goal was survival and not sleep. That night survival was enough. Maria moved her toe to the vestibule, shifted her bedding to the back, and had Reggie sit cross-legged by the door with one of the wool blankets around his shoulders. The thermometer climbed from 56 to 61 within 40 minutes, helped now by a second body. Moisture briefly fogged near the vent, then cleared. The system held. Reggie kept flexing his fingers under the blanket and staring at the insulation scraps as if warmth ought to look more official than that. At 3 a.m., Tasha tapped twice on the tarp and called Maria's name. Her small tent had not collapsed, but the zipper had iced and one seam had split enough to let wind drive through. Her feet were numb. Maria let her in without a speech. 3 adults changed the room. There was no more stretching out. No privacy. No comfort except the important kind. They sat knee to knee and shoulder to shoulder, taking turns leaning back while the others stayed upright. The thermometer moved between 58 and 63 depending on how recently the flap had opened. It never dropped to the outside air. That was the real proof of the shelter. Not comfort. Control. Outside, the bridge sounded hotter in the cold. Every truck impact came through the concrete with a brittle edge. Frost drew a pale crust over the gravel beyond the flap. Someone farther down the channel was coughing in long tearing bursts. Near dawn, a propane heater in another cluster failed, and 2 men there began walking in circles to keep feeling in their feet. When daylight came, the sun looked bright and felt weak. Maria opened the flap, checked the tie-outs, shook the damp off the outer shell, and let the retaining wall begin storing heat again. By late afternoon, the sleeping chamber was back in the low 60s. Word moves fast in any camp where people are cold enough to listen. By the second night of the cold snap, mockery had turned into questions. Not polite curiosity. Need. Vernon asked why the floor mattered more than another blanket overhead. Tasha asked why the vent did not throw away too much heat. Reggie asked why the doorway had to be so low. Maria answered while she worked. She showed them how trapped moisture steals more warmth than a small vent does. She showed them how still air does more work than layers packed flat. She showed them how the wall gives back what the sun put into it, but only if you do not smother it with damp fabric. She sent Reggie out for dry cardboard. This time he went without joking. Late on the third night, 2 men from farther down the channel half-carried another man toward Maria's shelter. Everyone called him Pops, though he was only in his 50s. His jeans were wet to the knee from a runoff pocket he had not seen in the dark, and his speech had gone slow. Wet and cold together changed the stakes fast. There was no room for a 4th adult to stay inside, so the little cabin became a warming box in shifts. Pop sat inside with Vernon for half an hour while Maria and Reggie wrapped his lower legs in spare wool and pushed dry cardboard under his boots in the vestibule. When he came out, his words were steadier and his hands opened and closed again without locking. A volunteer outreach van reached the bridge before dawn and took him to a warming site. Not everyone made it through that week. A man sleeping alone behind a loading dock 3 blocks away was found unresponsive after sunrise on Thursday. People heard about it by noon. No one spoke his name loudly. No one turned him into a warning speech. They just spoke more quietly after that. That is what cold does. It narrows every margin until skill, luck, and timing are all that stand between one morning and the next. By Friday, Maria's shelter had become more than her room. It was a working method. The wall held solar heat from the day. The low wedge shape reduced interior volume. The raised floor blocked conductive loss. The double skin trapped still air. The vent kept the inside dry enough to stay warm. Every part mattered because each part protected the others. At its fullest, the cabin held Maria, Tasha, and Reggie for almost 5 hours through the coldest part of the night. They did not sleep much. Their knees ached. Their backs burned from being bent. But the inside stayed above 57, and in the clear afternoon it reached 65 again before sunset. Around them, other shelters began to change. More skirts weighted with gravel, cardboard under sleeping pads, blankets hung with airspace instead of mashed flat, small covered vents cut high, raised platforms made from crates, pallet wood, cabinet doors, and scavenged blocks. Not because anyone suddenly became an engineer, because the woman they had dismissed was still dry, still alive, and willing to show her work. That mattered more than pride. When Reggie handed Maria a stack of flattened boxes on the last night of the cold snap, he did it without smiling. "Tell me where you want them," he said. The cold eased on a Sunday afternoon. Not all at once. The wind backed off first. Then the sun began to feel useful again. Meltwater ran in thin dark threads down the center of the channel. People came out of their shelters stiff and quiet, carrying the look of those who had spent several nights doing hard math in their heads. Under the bridge, the mood around Maria's cabin had changed. Before the freeze, people watched it like a gamble. Afterward, they watched it like a tool they might need to learn. Reggie crouched by the platform and knocked on the slats. "So the air under here," he said. "That's part of it." "Part of it," Maria said. Vernon pointed toward the rear vent. "And this doesn't let too much heat out." "It lets water out," Maria said. "Wet steals more than that gap does." Tasha asked the question that told Maria she had really been listening. "If the wall stays warmer than the air, does the gap help the wall work longer?" Maria looked at her and nodded. "Exactly." Within days, 2 more shelters nearby had raised sleeping platforms. One used milk crates and plywood, another used broken pallets and an old interior door. Neither looked good. That was not the point. Warmth rarely looks finished in its first version. The outside attention came from a county outreach worker named Lucia Herrera, who had spent 7 winters checking camps, lots, underpasses, and arroyos across the city. Lucia had seen every bad shelter idea there was to see. Plastic boxes dripping from the roof, open flames under nylon, wet mattress forts collapsing into mud. She came expecting another emergency and found Maria writing down morning temperatures on the back of a food carton with a golf pencil. Lucia asked if she could look inside. Maria said yes. She took her own readings. 42 outside at 8:30 in the morning. 58 inside. She checked the wall temperature with the back of her hand. She looked at the floor, the vent, the spacing between layers. Then she asked Maria to explain the build from the ground up. Maria did. Slowly. No showmanship. No big speech. Just order. Floor. Frame. Wall gap. Airspace. Vent. Doorway. Dry materials. Small volume. 2 days later, a subcontractor working on bridge maintenance farther down the channel stopped by after hearing about the little hot box under the overpass. He wore a hard hat and carried a laser measure. He looked into the shelter with the doubtful expression of a man used to houses, permits, and systems with labels on them. "Where's the heater?" he asked. "There isn't one," Maria said. He stepped inside for less than a minute, came back out, and looked at the shell again as if the missing answer had to be hidden somewhere. It was not that the physics were impossible. It was that he was thinking at the scale of buildings. Maria had built for the scale of one body, one cold night, one trapped pocket of air. At that scale, an inch mattered. Lucia came back the next week with a simple sketch sheet. Not official plans. Just rough diagrams with notes. Keep the sleeper off the ground, leave a high vent, avoid direct contact between inner and outer layers, face the opening away from the wind, keep materials dry, build smaller than your pride wants. She asked Maria to check the drawing before she shared it with other outreach teams. Maria agreed on one condition. No pictures of faces. No names unless people asked for them. That was the kind of authority she had now. Not legal authority. Not money. Earned authority. Over the next month the ideas spread. First to another underpass. Then to a camp near the rail line. Then to a woman living in a disabled sedan who used the same blanket and air gap method to create a sleeping chamber behind the front seats. People adapted the method to what they had. Some used moving blankets. Some used billboard vinyl. Some copied the wedge shape exactly because low and tight made sense after one bitter night in a bigger useless space. Maria never called it hers in any grand way. She called it the room. Or the setup. Or just the shelter. One evening after the cold had broken, She sat alone on the platform with the flap open and ran her hand over the nearest bed slat. For years she had maintained rooms no one remembered after checkout. She had fixed hidden leaks and failing seals before guests ever knew there was a problem. Under that bridge, with discarded materials and a $30 tarp, she had made another room. Smaller, rougher, more honest. Not a symbol, a room. And sometimes that is enough to return a person to herself. Maria did not leave homelessness the next week. Stories that rush to that ending usually care more about the audience than the person. She stayed under the bridge until late March, when the nights finally softened enough for the worst risk to pass. In April, with Lucia's help and a waiting list that moved slower than anyone wanted, she got a spot in transitional housing. One small converted motel room with a lock that worked, a rattling window unit, and a bathroom fan so clogged with lint she cleaned it herself on the second day. The room under the bridge did not come with her in one piece. It had never been meant to. She gave 2 wool blankets to Tasha, who was still outside then. Reggie took the raised floor idea and rebuilt his own setup with pallet wood and crate plastic. Vernon copied the covered vent and told more than one person it was the only reason his shelter stayed dry during sleet. The top itself lasted into spring, patched to the corners with seatbelt webbing and washers, the silver surface gone dull with dust. Lucia's sketch sheet traveled farther than the top did. Outreach workers carried copies when nighttime temperatures dropped. Not as a replacement for housing. No honest person would claim that. A better emergency shelter is still an emergency shelter. A raised floor is not justice. A dry blanket is not policy. But when the weather closes in and every other system is late, practical knowledge can buy time. Sometimes time is the whole difference. By the next winter, versions of Maria's setup had shown up in at least 4 camps Lucia knew about. One used scraps of billboard vinyl. Another used cabinet doors instead of bed slats. One woman built a smaller version against the passenger side of her dead car so the metal body blocked half the wind. None were exact copies. That was part of the strength. Good knowledge travels because it can bend. Maria found part-time maintenance work that summer at a church pantry 3 days a week. She changed faucet cartridges, patched drywall corners, replaced weather stripping, and tightened loose door hardware. She kept a folded notebook page in her bag with rough dimensions for the bridge shelter, not because she planned to need it again, but because experience had taught her that memory can be a tool too. That may be the hardest part for house people to understand. Preparation is not pessimism. For many Americans, it is a memory. If you went looking for Maria today, you would not find a statue or a program with her name on it. You would find something quieter. A method passed from hand to hand. A way of looking at scraps and seeing sequences. A refusal to believe that someone becomes ignorant just because they become poor. There were contractors who looked at that small shelter and frowned because it did not match the scale they knew. There were officials who would have called it temporary, unsafe, improvised, and they would not have been wrong. It was temporary. It was improvised. It was built in a place nobody should have to call home. It also worked. That is the part worth carrying with you. Not the romance of suffering. Not the idea that people should be forced to make do. The lesson is smaller and harder than that. Human beings keep knowledge in their hands long after the world stops making room for them. Dignity survives in method. Intelligence survives in repair. The person most people walk past may understand more about survival than the person paid to explain it. So when you see a top, a wall, a few bent scraps, and a person who has lost almost everything, what do you assume first? Failure? Disorder? Or the possibility that you are looking at a mind still working, still measuring, still building one more room against the cold? If you stayed with this story to the end, that means something. You gave your attention to a life many people would have ignored. There is another story on this channel waiting for you right now. Another person who used hard-earned knowledge to survive a season that should have broken them. These stories exist because skill and dignity do not disappear when housing does. Consider staying. Until next time, take care.